The Exorcist is a 1973 American supernatural horror film directed by William Friedkin. During the film, an evil demon possesses a 12-year-old girl, but then is sent packing by the Adepta Sororitas armor division. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the new souped-up Exorcist tank for the Sisters of Battle. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of all of our miniatures on the tabletop. We're going to be looking at one of the units from the new Sisters of Battle Codex today, the Church Organ Altar of Piety that shoots heavy anti-tank missiles, that is the Exorcist tank. I personally really quite like the new updated model. They've kept the original theme of the tank with its sheer insanity, and personally I think that they've executed it very well. So in this video we'll be having a look at its datasheet, any obvious buffs and synergies on the tabletop, and how I would run one as part of a Sisters of Battle army. In the background, the Exorcists function as mobile shrines to the Emperor that double up as heavy artillery pieces, blending the Adepta Sororitas' dual devotions to piety and purging the enemies of the Emperor. The Exorcist tanks rely on ancient technology that is poorly understood today, and almost without exception, Exorcist tanks are relics that date back to the Sisters' founding in the Age of Apostasy. So let's take a look at how this very holy artillery performs on the tabletop. Exorcists are of course a heavy support choice for Codex Adepta Sororitas, and they'll cost you 140 points if they're armed with anti-infantry rockets, and 170 points if they're armed with the Exorcist missile launcher, which is more anti-tank focused. They have a decent defensive stat line, with movement 12, weapon skill 6 up, ballistic skill 3 up, strength 7, toughness 8, 12 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3 up save. Of course they'll also have the Shield of Faith special rule, meaning they'll have a 6 up or better invul save. At base, each Exorcist is armed with one of the Exorcist missile launchers, or Exorcist conflagration rockets, and also a heavy bolter. The Exorcist missile launcher is a fearsome weapon indeed, with heavy 3d3, strength 8, AP -3 and damage d6. They're 48-inch range, making them one of the longest range weapons in the entire codex. There really isn't anything else in the Sisters of Battle army that puts down decent firepower at this sort of range, meaning that Exorcists are likely to be a core part of any pure Sisters of Battle list. Exorcists really put out a fearsome amount of firepower. On average, against a toughness 7 vehicle without an invul save, they'll do 7 or 8 wounds. Against a toughness 8 vehicle, such as another Exorcist or a Lehman Russ tank, they'll do about 6 wounds. And against a knight with a 4+ invul save, they'll do an average of 3 or 4 wounds. For its price, this is really respectable anti-tank firepower, and is obviously stronger against toughness 7 targets and those that lack an invul save. The other option, the conflagration rockets, are 48 inches heavy 3d6 weapons with strength 5, AP -2 and damage 1. So these are sort of a long-range horde clearing option, particularly suited for taking out infantry with a medium saving throw and toughness of 4 or 3. Particularly things like tactical marines, fire warriors and guardsmen are going to be the prime targets of this thing. On average it'll get 10 or 11 shots, which will translate into roughly 5 dead guardsmen, if you happen to be pointing it at that. It is significantly cheaper than the anti-tank variant, but honestly in my mind I think that you're probably better off taking the anti-tank missiles and paying the points for them. The Sisters have a lot more options for dealing with infantry units through their bolters and flamers, and there isn't really anything else that deals with tanks at range, as besides this tank, they really just need to rely on short-range multi-melters and close combat options. The only other option this Exorcist has access to is to take a hunter-killer missile, which isn't a bad shout as it'll have a similar range and damage output to the main cannon, and you're likely to be wanting to buff this thing up as much as you can, so I'd typically take one along for the extra 6 points it'll cost. The Exorcist has some special rules. It has Acts of Faith, which could potentially be handy for saving throws, and particularly for the damage d6 missile launcher, as being able to auto put through a 4, 5 or 6 could really up its damage output. It has access to sacred rites if you do take a full Sisters army. The Exorcist in particular is going to love the Spirit of the Martyr and Divine Guidance sacred rites. The Spirit of the Martyr will let it fire on a 5+ when it's destroyed, and getting an extra couple of missile hits could really do some damage, and Divine Guidance could give you the potential of getting an extra pip of AP whenever you roll a 6 to wound against vehicles, which is a small buff, but it will happen from time to time. It also has Shield of Faith. A 6-up invul is great and will protect it against AP -4 weapons. Besides this, it has the usual Explode special rule, for D3 mortal wounds within 6 inches if it explodes, and smoke launchers, which honestly I think you'd rarely use as you want to keep it shooting most of the time, but if it lacks any decent targets, making it -1 to hit for a turn could be very useful in the next phase. So overall, I think that the Exorcist tank is a really strong unit for the Sisters of Battle, and is likely to be a linchpin anti-tank unit in pretty much every competitive Sisters list that's actually pure Sisters of Battle. It'll be wanting to just sit back at the back and plink away with its heavy anti-tank weapons all game long, as it really has a decent damage output point for point. So let's move on to have a look at how we can get more out of it through all the buffs and synergies available to us on the tabletop. In terms of order convictions, there's several strong picks. Our Martyred Lady doesn't do loads for vehicle shooting units, but it will let you have access to Junitha Ruta, the Canoness on the Big Eagle, and her allowing reroll 1s to hit and wound is a significant buff to the Exorcist. If you're taking them in this order, I'd absolutely take her along. Having a few more miracle dice to play with in this order is certainly something that the Exorcist can make very good use of as well. Valorous Heart is a really strong choice for Exorcist, and I think that it's one that we'll see a lot. This one will give you a 6+ Feel No Pain type save, which is always great on big multi-wound models, translating to a 20% durability buff for the unit in question. Ignoring AP -1 is certainly a big deal as well, but it can get a lot better than this, because if you combine this with an Imagifier and their Litany ability, then you can ignore all AP -2 modifiers as well, meaning that these Exorcists can be fantastically durable, and they'll have really good durability against high AP weapons because of the Invul, and also low AP weapons because the low AP weapons won't get any AP at all. In this order, these Exorcists are going to be an absolute bastion of durability, and should be very strong at winning 1-for-1 firefights against other enemy armour long-range anti-tank units. They also have a great stratagem for Exorcists, which is 1 command point to ignore modifiers, and I'd certainly use this if I'm encountering any heavy modifier units, such as Eldar Flyers and the like, to get a significantly punishing volley off with an Exorcist. I'd say that Valorous Heart is overall probably the strongest choice for Exorcists. Probably the biggest thing for Ebon Chalice for Exorcists is that they can expend 2 miracle dice to get a single 6 miracle dice, which will be great on the saving throws and D6 damage rolls that the Exorcist puts out, and having some ability to shrug off mortal wounds can be handy as well, as it might be one of the most efficient ways to kill the Exorcist. Ardent Shroud could mean that you have really good positioning manoeuvrability with your Exorcist if you need it, though obviously it will have the -1 to hit if you move, but if you do, then you'll have on average 15-inch movement to move and shoot, which should be great for getting optimal line of sight and getting out of harm's way potentially. Finally, Sacred Rose will help this thing out with more miracle dice, which we've said are always great, and also 5+ Overwatch, which will have the Exorcist putting out a decent amount of shots, but ideally you really shouldn't be letting this thing get charged. In terms of character support, I would consider running a Canoness with these guys absolutely mandatory. She's a really cheap option for reroll 1s to hit, and is absolutely worth it if you're running at least 2 Exorcists, and you can also give the Canoness a Rod of Office to make her aura bigger. I've already mentioned that Junitha Ruta is a really good solid pick for rerolls for nearby Exorcists. Overall she'll provide a 36% buff to the damage output of the unit, so absolutely worth it. We've also already mentioned the Imagifier. Ignoring AP -1 shooting is certainly helpful, and it's incredibly helpful if you can ignore AP -2 with Valorous Heart. And having a Dialogus nearby can also be good, as this will allow you to add 1 to the miracle dice when you use those acts of faith, and if you are planning on throwing a few acts of faith into this vehicle to buff its shooting, this will probably amount to a fair bit of extra damage over the game. In terms of the stratagems, the Exorcist has a few of its own. First of all, we have Furious Recital, which is a 12-inch range leadership debuff that you can use for 1 command point. It's -1 for most units, and -2 for chaos units. In particular, I could see this being potentially useful against Chaos, as if you do manage to make 1 or 2 extra models from an expensive unit flee, or even just force your opponent to spend 2 CP on an auto pass, then I could see this being situationally useful. In reality though, I think that this is rarely going to come up, at least partly because you don't really want any Chaos units ending their turn intact within 12 inches of the Exorcist, as that's most likely going to lead to your Exorcist getting charged and tied up, so situational, but does have the potential to be used. A Moment of Grace can be used after you've failed to save for your Exorcist against a powerful weapon, allowing you to expend miracle dice to try and pass the save. I think that this could really be particularly powerful if the Exorcist gets shot by something really strong and you roll a 5 for the saving throw. Expending 1 command point and 1 miracle dice could potentially save you from taking a lot of wounds. Obviously this is going to be better the more powerful the gun it is that shoots you, so something like a Shadow Sword Cannon or Knight Castellan's Volcano Lance, could be very funny to just shrug off one of those saves with this stratagem. Suffer Not the Witch is a situational but incredibly powerful stratagem for an Exorcist. This will allow you to reroll wound rolls against Psykers for 1 unit for 1 command point. Most of the time you won't necessarily be able to target Psykers, but certain big units such as Magnus or Mortarion are prime targets for the Exorcist and can be shot by them. Rerolling wound rolls against these huge units is going to be a massive deal and will typically equate to a 33% damage buff, making this a very worthwhile stratagem. Another Exorcist unique stratagem is Devastating Refrain. You can use this one to reroll any or all of the dice used to determine the weapon's number of shots. You do have to declare this before you roll the number of shots though, which makes it a bit less useful. You can't just say, oh, I've rolled 3 ones for my Exorcist shooting, I'm going to use this stratagem now. You have to declare it before. This isn't actually all the biggest damage buff. For your anti-tank missiles, you're likely to get 1 extra shot out of it, so on average you'll be getting 7 shots rather than your average 6. It's not nothing, but it's not loads to be honest. Percentage-wise, it's a little bit more impressive on the anti-infantry variant, but then I think it's going to be less powerful on the anti-infantry variant because it's a weaker weapon overall. It'll give you a 21% buff to your number of shots on average when firing those conflagration rockets. I'd probably most consider using this if I was also using the targeting of the Psyker stratagem, or if I had other powerful buff units around the Exorcist to get the most out of it. It is a fairly weak stratagem for 1 command point, but there are times when you might want literally absolutely every ounce of damage that you can do with the tank to help give you extra chance of destroying a key target. Another situational but quite pricey stratagem is the Judgment of the Faithful. This could be handy if your Exorcist gets locked up, and when you fall back the Exorcist can still fire. Could be handy to keep your anti-tank guns firing if you really need them, if you've managed to get your Exorcist in close combat, or your opponent has done some sort of clever trick to get their units there. You will be hitting on 4s or worse if you do this though, as the Exorcist will have moved. Still, that will be an average of an extra 3 anti-tank missiles finding their target, so it's definitely going to be worth it in some situations. So how would I use an Exorcist in an actual game of 40k then? Quite clearly they're meant to be backline gunline tanks, with that incredible range, decent durability, and the fact that if they get into close combat, they become useless. Your strategy with them is going to be to probably deploy them as far back as necessary to keep them safe from any charging threats, but within range of their ideal targets for those 48-inch missile launcher range. I wouldn't worry too much about the heavy bolter, I'd focus on the missiles and just use the heavy bolter to plink away at any other targets that happen to come in range. The real value of this tank is those missiles, so don't get too distracted by the heavy bolter. It'll really make sense to think about the deployment for the Exorcist quite carefully, because obviously if you move, you're going to be taking the -1 hit penalty for moving and firing heavy weapons. It's not the end of the world, but on quite a powerful unit it's good to be having it fire at full efficiency. At least some units from the rest of your army are going to need to focus on screening those Exorcists, as really the main weakness that they have is being locked down in close combat. You really don't want any units deep striking in next to them, charging them, and rendering your fire base useless. I would absolutely deploy them next to a Canoness, as those reroll ones are just great value, and I'd strongly think about putting an Imagifier next to them if the enemy has a decent amount of AP-1 shooting, or AP-2 for Valorous Heart. These are absolutely a great choice to use Miracle Dice on, as we've already mentioned, particularly in saving throws and on those damage D6 rolls. It certainly could be worth having a Dialogus there to get you the most out of those Miracle Dice. There are plenty of stratagem options that you have available, and we've already been through them. For me, the only one that I'd use routinely is the anti-psyker shooting one, if they do have a key target. The rest are just a little bit more underwhelming or situational for me to use all the time, but it's good to be aware of them as options. As the game continues, it might well be worth having your Exorcists advance forward so they can be on objectives or get a better line of sight later in the game. They actually really have quite decent movement at movement 12, so if and when they do move, they'll be able to reposition pretty well. Finally, if you are going second in a game, I'd consider using prepared positions if they're having to set up out of cover, though for me they are probably one of the easier tanks to get a cover save on, because they're really quite tall. You could park them behind a ruin wall, and hopefully still have that nice church organ poking up over the top, so they can get line of sight and unleash their holy missiles. So obviously if you're able to do that instead, you could save yourself a couple of CP. Within the Sisters Codex, they don't really have any good competitors in my mind. 48-inch range anti-tank shooting is really useful to have, and nothing else can do that. The other heavy support option is the Retributors with their multi-melters, which can be 36-inch range if you're willing to pay significant CP. but in terms of damage output per points and survivability, I just don't think that they hold up compared with the Exorcist. Out of Codex, the Exorcist is really quite similar to the Astra Militarum Tank Commander. They're both 12 wound toughness 8 vehicles with great range and good anti-armor capability. If we're looking at a similar costed one, say with a las cannon and battle cannon, they're pretty much equal in anti-armor capability. The Exorcist is a little bit tougher with that handy 6-up invul save and access to miracle dice for saving throws, but the Tank Commander has a little bit of extra movement due to grinding advance allowing him to move and shoot while counting as remaining as stationary. So it's good to see that they compete well with Tank Commanders, as they're one of the top choices in terms of ranged anti-tank at the moment in the meta. I honestly think the Exorcist might well be strong enough to be worth running in an Imperial Allies type list. They're just very efficient for their points and really quite tough all around. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on these guys, particularly if you have some battle experience with them in the new Codex. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos like this. I'll be trying to cover a few more of the core sisters options over the next few weeks, so let me know if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see. I do have a Patreon page, so if you'd like to support the channel, please feel free to head on over to there, as it helps me keep what I'm doing and focus on these videos more than my regular job. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.